Hey guys, today we're in the book of Leviticus chapter 5. Now remember, the first 7 chapters are about the sacrifices. We've had the burnt sacrifice, the grain sacrifice, the peace sacrifice, the sin sacrifice, and today we're going to get 2 more, all right? We start out with verse 1. It never says this here, but it's just better for you to know it now because these sacrifices all have different names as you read along. But starting in chapter 5, it's still kind of under a sin offering or a sin sacrifice, but it will be later called the trespass sacrifice. Even later on in the book of Leviticus, it will be called that. So just know it now, right? So you have the trespass offering or the trespass sacrifice. If anyone sins, that he hears a public adjudication to testify, though he is a witness, whether he has seen or come to know the matter, yet does not speak, he shall bear his iniquity. Even in Israel, it wasn't enough just to tell the truth, but Israel had to always speak the truth. If they knew falsehood, even though they wasn't a part of it, they had to speak justly, right? So if they knew something to be true but didn't speak up for it, they would be sinning. Verses 2 and 3 talks about touching unclean things. Now, as of now, we're not for sure what that is. In a few chapters, we'll learn what those are, right? But if you touch something unclean, whether animal unclean or humanly unclean, you have to do the trespass offering. Verse 4, if you take a rash oath, or it means if you take an oath and you break it, you must do the trespass sacrifice. Verse 5, when you realize his guilt of any of these and confess his sins, he must be committed. So once again, you've got to know it and you've got to confess it, right? You can't be forgiven for something if you don't confess it. And that word confess, I don't know if we've talked about it in previous, just means to agree with God, right? If you get lost on your path of holiness and you do these things, you agree with God, God, I'm lost, and then do the sacrifice. And so here, starting in verse 6, it tells us what we should do. What should we do? We should bring a female, notice that, lamb or goat, right? So a female lamb or goat, take it to the priest. But if you can't afford a goat or a lamb, then you can bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a sin offering, one for a burnt offering. So once again, we have statuses, and it's just all about really how much can you afford. If you can afford a goat or lamb, that's what you have to do. But if you can't afford that, you can bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. And notice why it says 2. One will be a burnt offering, one will be a sin offering. The sin offering or the trespass offering will atone the sin. The burnt offering, going back to chapter 1, will show that you still love God. You're renewing your commitment. God, I got off the path, but now I'm back on it. So one to atone your sin, the other one to bring you back together, right? And notice verse 10, if he does this, he shall be forgiven. But notice verse 11. This is truly shows you the heart of God. You can bring a lamb or goat. If you can't afford that, do 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, verse 11. But if you can't afford 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, you can bring a tenth of a ephah of fine flour. Now, I don't know about you, my measuring cups don't measure in biblical times, so that's 2 quarts. You can bring 2 quarts of fine flour, okay? So it's kind of the least of least. You need flour to cook. Most of the poorest of poors would have that. A little side note, that in the years of the wanderings where there was manna would have been impossible to do this. This would have been a huge task, would have been very costly if you did this sacrifice. So just know that, put that back in your mind. When we get to the book of Numbers, we'll talk about it a little bit more. But they could bring 2 quarts of fine flour. But notice what it says, you shall put no oil or no frankincense. The other sacrifices required oil and sacrifices inside of the flour. This one is not because it is a sin offering or a trespass offering. You're doing this not because you love God, not because you want to give him your best. You're doing this because you've done something wrong. And so the burning of this flower should not be fragrant. It's because of sin. It's gross. It's grotesque to God. So it's being burnt up. So God doesn't want the aroma, good smelling aroma, to be attached to sin. Bad aroma, bad sin. Good aroma, good offering, right? Does that make sense? And also, poor people, they couldn't afford oil. They couldn't afford frankincense. And so we know about unleavened bread from Exodus, but the reality is rich people would have eaten bread with yeast, and poor people would have eaten without yeast. They would have eaten unleavened bread all the time. Much like today in America, third world country don't have yeast. They eat unleavened, non-yeast bread all the time. But just notice God does, right? He gives us the rich, the kind of middle class, and the super poor, right? Those that could just bring 2 quarts of oil. But notice verse 13, if they do this, he shall be forgiven. God still says that he will forgive them. And then starting in verse 14, we move from the trespass offering or the end of the sin offering, and then we move to another one called the guilt offering. Okay, so the trespass offering and the guilt offering. And so the Lord spoke to Moses, if anyone commits a breach of faith, a sins unintentionally in any of the holy things of the Lord, he shall bring to the Lord as him compensation of the holy things, right? What is this talking about? This is when you sin against things that are devoted to God, right? So what does that mean? Well, we've learned of them, some of them, and we will continue to learn of some of them as we read through the book of Leviticus. But we know that God has told them they need to bring the first fruits. They need to give their firstborn, right? We're going to find out in a few chapters about they should bring a tithe. How about vowed offerings? People who would collect and say, I'm going to give this to God, but things get a little sketchy and they take away their offering. So if somebody desecrates things that are already devoted to God, they have to do a guilt offering. A guilt offering is a bad offering, right? In my mind, of a pastor of a church, if somebody brings in a guilt offering in the tabernacle as they're walking up to the door of the tabernacle, this is the people that the Israel would talk about. Oh my goodness, because they've done something not just wrong, not just a sin, they've done an intentional or an unintentional sin against God himself. This is a bad, bad sin. If you have to do this, you've done something wrong, right? So let's figure out what that is, right? So if you've desecrated the first fruits, the firstborn, the tithe, you take away valid offerings. I'm going to give this to God. I'm not. Here's what you got to do. You got to take a ram without blemish, a ram, right? So more than a goat, more than a lamb. It would have been costly. Or valued in silver shekels. So if you didn't have a ram, you could give money, silver, that would be equivalent of the price of a ram. For a guilt offering. He shall also make restitution for what he has done amiss in the holy thing, and shall add a fifth to it to give it to the priest. And the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering, and he shall be forgiven. So if he's cheated God on the first fruits or the firstborn or the tithe or valid offerings, he has to bring a ram or equivalent of silver and add 20%. So if I cheated God, for example, out of my $100 tithe, a guilt offering would mean that I would have to bring to God, to the priest, my $100 and say, I cheated God on this, and here's a 20. I owe God 120 because I cheated God. It's a bad offering. You're cheating God. But notice this, verse 17, if anyone sins doing any of the things that the Lord's commandments ought not to be done, though he did not know it, then realizes his guilt, he shall bear his iniquity. So if somebody in Israel does this, he can't claim, oh, I didn't know. He's still guilty of it, right? So you're guilty whether you knew it or you didn't know it, right? But keep reading. He shall bring to the priest a ram without blemish of flock, or its equivalent of silver for a guilt offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him for the mistake that he made unintentionally. He shall be forgiven. What's missing there? The 20%. The 20%. Somebody who knew they were cheating God and intentionally cheated God, they owe God that plus 20%. The person who unintentionally cheated God, didn't know, didn't mean to, but realized, oh my gosh, I cheated God, and he comes to the priest, he owes the priest, he owes God what he was going to give him, but he doesn't have to pay the 20%, the fifth, right? Now, why is that? Jesus even talks about this himself in the parable in Luke chapter 12, talking about the servants who knew his masters well and disobeyed were beaten. The servants who didn't know but still disobeyed were beaten, but with less lashes. You're still accountable for the sin, but there was no intentionality for that. So you still get punished, but you don't get punished above and beyond for being intentional about it. Verse 18 says, he shall be forgiven. It is a guilt offering. He has indeed incurred guilt before the Lord. Man, you would think to yourself, where's Jesus in this? Could you imagine sacrificing every time you intentionally or unintentionally disobeyed God? We would all live at the church. I'd be the busiest guy on the face of the planet. Every pastor would be busy, right? But it was Jesus who came and died on a cross, being fully man, fully God, with the perfect blood, right? The perfect blood of no sin that paid for sin once and for all. That we wouldn't have to continue to do this, but those who believe in Jesus, their sin that they've always done, that they are doing now and will do, has been forgiven. It doesn't mean that they can live in sin, and it doesn't mean they don't need to confess their sin. It doesn't mean that they don't need to fall on their knees before God and be thankful of his grace and mercy of forgiving their future sins. But we're not required every single day, every single minute to keep a tally and to keep our sacrifices of knowing what we're doing intentionally and unintentionally. Jesus Christ died once and for all those who would believe. That's why we don't have to sacrifice every single hour of every single day. I hope that makes sense, and we will see you tomorrow in chapter 6. God bless.